BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
You're listening to Artworks, imaginative documentaries about culture and the arts from BBC Radio 4. Available only on BBC Sounds.
Last year, I started exchanging emails with the British filmmaker Christopher Nolan. Nolan has directed some of the biggest blockbusters of the 21st century, huge, critically lauded films including Dunkirk, Interstellar and Oppenheimer. But he wanted to talk to me about a group of homegrown filmmakers who he feels paved the way for his Hollywood success. A group he believes haven't truly had their time in the spotlight.
It was an instinctive thing they were doing. They were just making increasingly beautiful images.
I'm cultural historian Christopher Frayling, and Christopher Nolan has invited me to his home in Los Angeles. Together, we're telling a new story of British film.
It's a group of filmmakers who completely changed the way films were made.
It's the story of the Adland Five, five homegrown directors who came to the movies from advertising between the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. Not through the film industry and not via film school, but from directing television ads for the likes of Heineken and Hovis.
I were no more than knee-high to a grasshopper when I ran off from home. I packed up my marbles, my catapult and my Hovis sandwiches and off I went.
Across our conversations so far, Christopher Nolan and I have discussed how Alan Parker, Ridley Scott, Hugh Hudson and Adrien Lyne all went from working side by side in London's Adland to injecting new energy into Hollywood with films such as Fame, Alien, Chariots of Fire and Fatal Attraction. But there's one other member of the Adland Five we've yet to properly meet. Tony Scott, the younger brother of Ridley, whose breakthrough film we mentioned all the way back at the start of episode 1. Top Gun, released in 1986, would come to epitomise the idea of a high-concept blockbuster, a film that can be summarised in just one line.
I feel the need for speed. Ow!
When you do a project, you write a one-pager, a synopsis of...
More of a one paragraph.
Oh, one paragraph, okay.
It doesn't usually run to a full page.
Is there a slight analogy with the Adland Five here? I mean, they make a pitch, you've got to be able to write it on the back of an envelope, you've got to be able to say it in a very succinct way. And if you can't say it in a succinct way, there's something wrong with it.
It used to be called high concept, and it was frowned upon a little bit, as a lot of their work and what they brought to films was. Everything was too high concept. It was the sort of back of an envelope, fish out of water or buddy cop, or all these sort of things that get, jammed together. But there's efficiency in there, and there's also beauty in that. If the idea can be simple, it's a haiku. If you can look at it on half a page, it's going to translate well to the 2-hour form. It was about the idea and the glamour of the idea, the excitement of the idea. That's how you get studios on board. That's how you get actors on board. That's how you get the world interested. And a lot of what these guys did was like that. Simpler, high concept ideas transmit well through the culture, and they bring people to your work. And I think that was understood in the advertising world of the 70s and 80s really well. And I think it translated excellently to Hollywood. And I think if you look at the success of Tony Scott with Jerry Bruckheimer, it is very much about high concept.
Yes, I can imagine Top Gun being one paragraph.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Top Gun's director, Tony Scott, like his older brother Ridley, was a graduate of the Royal College of Art, my old stamping ground. He went on to work for his brother in the advertising business and, at a very early stage in his career, was quoted as saying, "I cornered the market in sexy rock and roll stuff." But he certainly didn't learn all that at art school.
Well, one of the young filmmakers to emerge recently from the Royal College of Art is Tony Scott. I asked Tony Scott how his artistic filmmaking at the RCA had prepared him for entering the commercial industry.
It didn't prepare me at all. It was taking me away from the commercial industry, which I feel is one problem about the film school, is that you do become too insular. That's the right word. You become too tied up with your own ideas, too aesthetic.
Is film school much more easygoing than the film industry?
Yes, very much easygoing. That, in fact, is one of the problems. It's maybe too easygoing. It is a shock, actually, coming into the industry, coming into something which is so precise and professional. It is a bit of a shock.
Ridley certainly takes credit for the so-called corruption of his brother, because apparently Tony wanted to do documentaries when he left the Royal College, and Ridley was like, come on over here, if you work in advertising you'll have a Ferrari within a year, and he did, apparently. But certainly once he got there, Tony jumped in, feet first. It was always interesting to hear him talk about his first film, because his first feature was The Hunger with David Bowie's
vampire film with Catherine
Deneuve.
Deneuve and David Bowie. Yeah.
And it's an unbelievably beautiful film, photographically, production design-wise. The makeup's extraordinary. I mean, all kinds of things going on.
And David Bowie disintegrating in a hospital waiting room. It's absolutely marvellous scene.
Yeah,
extraordinary.
I mean, wonderful stuff. But it's pretty bleak and a little slow, and it's an art film. It's not something that anyone in the critical establishment would ever have termed an art film. But Tony turned it an art film. As he put it, he couldn't get arrested after that film.
You'll be back. When the hunger hurts so much you've lost all reason, then you have to feed. And then you need me to show you how.
You're crazy.
In a weird way, I don't think it ever stood a chance, because it was... It represents a real pinnacle of kind of 80s stylization, but without the narrative underpinnings to sell it to an audience. Yeah. The concept's there. It's the coolest people in the 80s. I mean, Bowie, Deneuve, one of the most beautiful, wonderful, stylish 80s people, being vampires, going to
great
nightclubs.
Costumes, beautiful lighting.
Exactly. Bauhaus on the soundtrack. It's a fascinating glimpse into this time, because it is an art film, but the art that it's presenting was the language of commercials, was the language of perfume ads. And at the time, that was seen as low art. I think now, in retrospect, I think it's actually very beautiful and very informative as to what were the fascinations, what were the visual devices, the sound devices, the music's extraordinary.
He was quite late in the game compared to the others. The others moved into feature filmmaking late 70s, early 80s.
He was a bit younger.
80s.
There's a few years between him and Ridley, so he came into it a little bit younger.
Yeah.
And he took a little longer. But boy, when he made that leap and when he went over to Hollywood, he changed Hollywood forever.
It all comes back to the Saab ad of 1983 and Hollywood super producer Jerry Bruckheimer. The ad with the car racing the jet plane.
When people look at Ridley Scott's Apple Mac ad, the 1984 ad, that's derived from Blade Runner, which he'd already made. He'd already gone to the world with this extraordinary vision and then was asked to sort of redo it in commercials. But with Tony's Saab ad, you're really seeing, for the first time, literally a Hollywood producer looking at a piece of marketing material and saying, that's the guy I want to do my fighter jet film. He knows how to shoot it. That's the style of it. That's the feel of it. Yeah. And it really is. You see the Saab ad and you see the birth of Top Gun and the style of that.
Yes.
Saab. Nothing on earth comes close.
I was surprised that I was offered Top Gun, being an Englishman, to shoot a piece of Americana. But the producers, the boys, Simpson and Bruckheimer, had a very particular fix on why they wanted me to come along. They felt I, as a European, could be more objective about the American culture and present the American Navy in a different light.
I gotta do something here. I still can't believe it. I gotta give you your dream shot. I'm gonna send you up against the best. You two characters are going to Top Gun.
It's a phenomenal piece of craft. The sound in that film is absolutely remarkable. They were putting an explosion on every cut underneath the sound of the engine, because Tony was insisting every time you cut to it, it refreshes that punch. Bingo! I saw it in the Empire Leicester Square when I was a kid, and it was absolutely deafening, but completely absorbing.
What do you think about, and again, this relates to the Adland approach to filmmaking, the relationship of Top Gun to the Navy? Because, the Navy give all these facilities, 3 aircraft carriers, a couple of dozen fighter jets, even some pilots and all the rest, a huge cooperation.
Yeah.
And when the film came out, some of the press said, well, it's a kind of commercial for recruitment for the Navy Air Force and so on. What do you feel about that?
Well, I feel that certainly if you're talking about film criticism, it's a very lazy critique of the film. It's obvious and doesn't really speak to what the experience is.
No, it doesn't tell you about the movie. No.
It doesn't tell you about the movie and doesn't tell you about the experience of the movie. In, call it ethical terms or moral terms, the idea of, is something a commercial, not a commercial? Well, it's a point of view of what the military could represent in emotional terms, in visual terms, in cinematic terms. And it's a completely valid point of view. It's not definitive or correct, or and certainly there are a lot of objections in political terms you could raise to it. But it's not a political film, and the appeal of it for the audience is undeniable.
We don't make policy here, gentlemen. Elected officials, civilians do that. We are the instruments of that policy. And although we're not at war, we must always act as though we are at war.
It's this very Reagan-era conservative view of the military and the greatness of the military and all the rest. But just as with British cinema of the 1940s, there's a place for these things. It's a point of view, and cinema embraces all points of view. The fact that the resources were granted by the military, I think, is much more testament to, firstly, Bruckheimer's brilliance as a producer and his ability to wrangle resources. Which
and it couldn't have been made without it. It couldn't have been made without that cooperation.
Well, it would have been made very differently. It would have been a much poorer looking film.
Just one plane.
Absolutely. But, you know, I mean, Tony took massive pride in having, on Crimson Tide, having shot a nuclear submarine leaving the pen without the cooperation of the military and stealing the shot because he knew when it was leaving the base.
Oh, really?
Getting in a helicopter and grabbing that shot. Yeah. So people play the game and they do what they need to do. I think the cooperation with Top Gun is more a testament to somebody within the Navy figuring out how valuable that type of storytelling would be to them.
Yes.
But you're talking about filmmakers with a very strong point of view. They're making the film they want to make. They believe in it. They're not doing it for the military. They're not doing it as a commercial for the military. No. They're putting forward something they're really excited about.
And even though it was hugely successful, in interviews, Tony Scott expresses frustration about, they won't let me really go for visual impact, you know, that Hollywood's slowing me down and all the things we normally say, you know, Britain is slow and a bit sluggish, but Hollywood, you can do anything. He doesn't say that. He says, I've got all these innovations I really want to try, and it frustrates me.
No. And Tony... It's reductive to compare brothers. I mean, I have a brother who I work with, who works in the movie business.
Of course,
It's a little bit reductive to compare them. But the sort of conventional wisdom that arose that Ridley was the slightly more serious and Tony was the more popcorn and all the rest, there's certain validity to that. But at the same time, when you look at Tony's desire to sort of punch a hole in the screen and the mise-en-scène that he developed with this long lens, multi-camera approach, lighting for 3 or 4 cameras at the same time, you know, he had a hand-cranked 35mm camera that he would get out and just throw into the mix. So you're looking at films where you're seeing the flash frame of when the magazine rolls out, cut in. I mean, truly avant-garde techniques, but always within a very tightly controlled commercial context. Whatever the box that was built to contain the high-concept vehicle, all of his avant-garde techniques worked well within that. Yeah. And it's an extraordinary new voice in Hollywood in the 1980s, and it changed everything forever. It changed the way, you know, Hollywood movies were made.
It's like a sort of new avant-garde coming from within the industry instead of from outside, which is very unusual. I mean, the Crucible is commerce. It's they want it. I want a slice of it. I want to get in there. I want to break into the Citadel. It's funny that the avant-garde comes from that impulse.
And it's a true avant-garde because it's not recognized as that.
Yes, exactly.
You know, there are no obvious signifiers of the avant-garde because their avant-garde was coming from the photography, the sound, the music, the mise-en-scène.
And here's another paradox. Yes, there was an avant-garde at work within the Hollywood mainstream, but there was another sort of avant-garde going on throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Within the advertising industry of all places, and especially within commercials which had to include health warnings. Hugh Hudson's ad for Benson. We're not allowed to mention cigarette ads, but anyway, his ad for Benson and Hedges.
Well, we have to mention cigarette ads.
A helicopter drops this giant sardine can into the swimming pool. A diver swims towards it with the giant key. Oh, first of all, you've got a chameleon at the beginning of it. You've got to have that. And then he opens this giant sardine, and inside is gold, Benson and Hedges. And in a way, I think these advertisements introduced the British public to abstract art, because they weren't allowed by that stage to make any claims for the cigarettes. All you can do is imagery.
And crucially, because it was a closing door through this period we're talking about, that's why cigarette advertising is so key to this discussion. Eventually, it wound up only in the cinema on 18 or 15 rated films. So I sat in a cinema and I watched the Silk Cut ad with the Christo curtain across the valley. You talk about abstract art, there's no more abstract art than that. It is literally a massive silk curtain across the French Valley. And,
At a time when you had to go to fairly esoteric galleries to see that kind of art, suddenly, on a vast scale, these abstract images are being shown to the public who know how to read them. So there's a sliced bit of silk. Equals silk cut. All you're reduced to doing is advertising the colour of the pack. That's basically all you can do, because you can't make any other claims.
No, and so it's massively innovative in a way that if someone has sort of chosen to make a very arch campaign, and you see this a lot in advertising to this day, where people decide to be a bit clever with it and not show the product. It doesn't usually work, but I think when it's forced legislatively, because we're trying to stop people dying of lung cancer,
Yes, exactly.
then you say, okay, now you have to figure out how to flog it. I mean, the ethics of that we'll leave for another discussion,
Yes.
but the creative innovation was extraordinary.
I always think it's interesting that David Putnam's dream was British films made in Britain with global appeal. But in the end, all these people ended up in Hollywood.
Yeah.
There's a Britishness about what they're doing, I think. But do you think they brought a British sensibility to Hollywood?
I think they brought a fresh sensibility to Hollywood. I think it would be reductive to say that there's anything of the national character in the visual presentation and the design of those films. They brought a freshness of view, whether it was specifically British or not. It was an outsider's point of view. And Hollywood has always massively benefited from that sort of outsiders infusion, wherever it's come from, whether it's Germany, whether it's Northern California, whether it's, whatever, something outside the system feeding into it. People from other countries, filmmakers from other countries, movie stars from other countries, they were in that great tradition, steeped in their own culture and having started to working within that. But then through the global advertising business, reaching out to sort of more universal ideas of communication and glamour and so forth, and then bringing that to Hollywood, the freshness, so that people like Jerry Bruckheimer would see that set of fresh voices and go, okay, that's a new thing. That's a thing that can amplify filmmaking.
So there was a clear benefit for Hollywood, but what was really in it for the filmmakers? Did the Adland Five feel any guilt about leaving Britain behind? Let's go back to the director of the first ever Adland film, Bugsy Malone, Alan Parker.
All of us are brought up on American movies wherever you live in the world. You're not coming into a foreign land called the United States. We've had that, that foreign land, rammed down our throats ever since we grew up. I mean, Germans were running away from Hitler. Maybe we were running away from Margaret Thatcher. I'm not nationalistic, really, in any way. I do feel good about being British. Feeling any kind of remorse or guilt? Absolutely not. British film industry did absolutely nothing for my generation of filmmakers. Nothing at all. There were no companies that were any good. We were attacked by every single British critic when we started. We were put down by the British Film Institute, who supposedly should be supporting British filmmakers. We were attacked by everyone. So guilt? No. Don't feel any guilt whatsoever, no.
Alan, Adrien, Lyne, Ridley and Tony Scott were all well established in Hollywood by the mid-1980s. But there was one exception.
Hugh Hudson is the interesting case. So there's a very interesting moment in his career where post-Chariots of Fire, he takes on a Hollywood script by Robert Towne, Greystoke, new version of Tarzan, and he very much brings it into a British mode of filmmaking. Big Hollywood, but we're going to bring it to England. It's a fascinating movie, beautifully made, with some incredible things in it, but a few missteps. Famously dubbing Andie MacDowell for Glenn Close, so that, replacing her voice, things like that. And the film was not massively successful. It was a bit of a letdown after Chariots of Fire.
Hugh Hudson's follow-up was even less successful. Released in 1985, Revolution starred Al Pacino as an illiterate fur trapper caught up in epic historical events he can't understand. A man with a truly memorable accent.
Ned, get your sausage, then douse the fire. Go ahead, son. You could hear the city a mile off. New York, going crazy.
He makes a film about the American Revolution, but shoots it in
King's
Lyne
Lynn.
Regis. King's Lynn, no, that's right, King's Lynn.
Exactly.
And there was a response from the American film industry there that was not good. I think it was seen as a type of, I suppose today you would call it almost cultural appropriation, or a type of arrogance of the sort of British taking on this story of Americans fighting the British. And that was a very disastrous situation for British money and British film. Viewed today, the film is, I mean, it's a work of art, there's no question. It's a radical way of presenting history. I remember one critic referring to Hugh Hudson's worm's eye view of history, which, because it was this sort of anti-glamour breaking through the crustiness of period film.
Yes, yes.
But I think it really speaks to the core of where Hudson separates from these directors, where they do go Hollywood, and Hugh did not jump across that chasm.
But it is interesting because I read somewhere that your father thought that of the advertisers, Hugh Hudson was the best.
He was the one he was the most interested to see, well, what would he do
next? And yet, in terms of his filmmaking career, he's the one who sort of, fantastic start, Chariots of Fire. Then it sort of fizzles out. It just shows that success in the advertising world doesn't automatically transpose into success in the filmmaking world.
Not at all, and certainly hasn't very often since. And that's part of what we haven't really talked about with these five, but they opened the door and then closed it fairly firmly after they walked through.
These group successes tend to pull up the ladder after them.
They do tend to, inadvertently. But the interesting thing with Hugh is that I would also say a lot of his advertising success followed later as well. So his campaign for British Airways, the famous Smile campaign, for example, that was fairly long after it. And I would say that that was not as true of the others. I mean, obviously, they carried on, certainly Ridley carried on being a massive force in advertising in a business sense and in a creative sense. But Hugh Hudson, in a way, his most famous campaign comes after the films.
Delibes plus drums plus giant lips made up of hundreds of happy people. Unforgettable. So while his Hollywood career wasn't as successful as the others, it's Hugh Hudson's television commercials which endure.
You have to be right on the cutting edge in Adland. You have to be working at that sharp, tip of the spear, or else you get left behind. Bringing that sensibility to cinema, I think, is what kept these guys having extraordinary success after success. I mean, I went to a screening of Gladiator 2 the other night and had the pleasure of doing a Q&A with Sir Ridley, and he has been doing this for a long time. If you look at Alan Parker's career and certainly Tony's and whatever, it's the same thing. There's like success after success. Long periods of not working with Adrien Lyne, for example, for whatever reason. But while they were in there and in the game, they were able to work at that cutting edge of what cinema should be.
So what happened to the Adland Five after that rich period in film history when the British came and saw and conquered? Well, Ridley Scott continues to be one of the most prolific directors of big films in Hollywood, well into his 80s. And Adrien Lyne, after a gap of 20 years, re-emerged in 2022 with a characteristically erotic and star-studded thriller. Alan Parker, Hugh Hudson and Tony Scott continued for many years to make distinctive and important films before their deaths. One of Parker's last was, in my view, also his best, Angela's Ashes. One of Hudson's was his re-edited and much improved Revolution, while Tony Scott made 5 more blockbusting movies for producer Jerry Bruckheimer. But the legacy of the Adland Five lives on, not least in the work of Christopher Nolan. What is that legacy?
Collectively, they have a contribution. It's about the technique of filmmaking, and not simply photography or sound, but the combination, all these approaches to narrative. and what movies can do and how they can affect an audience. And those innovations sustain to this day. But I think it's a testament to the sheer artistry of the five. They're all in very different ways. They're very recognizable independently. But I think the difference between the lighting of an Alan Parker film, the lighting of a Tony Scott film, is very apparent to even a casual film goer. And yet they're both coming from this very hyper-stylized place of really wanting, and this is what I see as their main contribution, they find ways with picture and sound to tell you what the world feels like. And that's another dimension. They're adding this other dimension to your involvement in the film without using, 3D or whatever. But their approach cinematically is so involving that you really get a sense of the feel of the worlds that they're in, and that really enhances the immersion. And I think that has stayed with us. I think if you look at the history of movies since, there's a period in the 90s, particularly when Quentin Tarantino comes in, and Quentin and all those who followed, very much pushing in a different direction. But then over time, their innovations come back, and they're with us today, and they're very much influencing the way Hollywood makes its films today.
The Adland Five, of course, looked much like successful British filmmakers who'd come before. These were 5 white men with access to resources and opportunities. But what they pulled off with that access was revolutionary for British cinema and cinema in general. The visual dexterity, the rewatchability, the tactility, the creation of believable worlds, the innovative use of music and sound, the immersion. Whatever critics back in the 70s and 80s, and to this day, may have said about movies like Flashdance, Top Gun, Chariots of Fire, Bugsy Malone, and The Duelists.
Being lost in the mystery of the films you're making is what I see great filmmakers doing, the filmmakers I've enjoyed. And I think one of the reasons I responded so much to the work of these 5 directors is they're not responsive to the criticisms of their work in any way. So, if you look at any one of them, no matter what, Pauline Kael chose to throw at them or whatever, you look at what they did next, they just doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on what they were doing because they were chasing something that I don't think they understood, but passionately. I mean, people don't use the term creative often enough in the filmmaking process because it's somewhat an industrial process. And I think these guys, fully understood that. But the creativity at the heart of it, Alan Parker's drawings for Bugsy Malone or The Wall or whatever, or the storyboards for Ridley's movies, the little Ridley Grahams draw. Because you're seeing that raw creativity. And I think also when you look back at their ads, you're seeing the beginnings of their films.
Hollywood and the Adland Five was presented by me, Christopher Frayling, in conversation with Christopher Nolan. It was a Prospect Street production for BBC Radio 4, produced by Jane Long.